Hey everyone, welcome back to Inside Vietnam. If you're new here, this channel is where we tell the stories that don't usually get told, the ones men carry home from this country in their chest, the ones they're too embarrassed or too raw to share with their families back home. Stories about what happens when you arrive somewhere, looking for one thing, and find something else entirely waiting for you. Today's story comes from Brendan. He's 59, from Cork in the south of Ireland, a carpenter by trade, a man who spent 30 years measuring twice and cutting once, who built things for a living and prided himself on knowing exactly what he was working with before he started. He's not a naive man. He's not a fool. He's the kind of man you'd want on your side, the kind who shows up and does the work and doesn't complain about it. And he came to Da Nang, Vietnam, a little over 2 years ago. What happened to Brendan here isn't like most of the stories on this channel, even though in some ways it's the oldest story we tell. What makes it different is how the truth found him. Not through a friend's warning, not through a private investigator, not through catching someone in a lie. What unraveled everything for Brendan was a conversation he overheard. A conversation in a language he wasn't supposed to understand. This one's gonna stick with you. Here's his story, in his own words. Right. So, I'm not sure where to start with this, to be honest with you. I'll try the beginning, which is what my Siobhan used to tell me whenever I'd start a story from the middle, which was apparently my habit. She'd put her hand up like a guard stopping traffic and say, "Brendan, start at the beginning, so I'll try." The beginning, I suppose, is 30 years of good work. I was a carpenter. Joiner, really. If we're being precise about it, the finer end of the trade, fitted kitchens, staircases, bespoke cabinetry for people with more money than I'd ever see. I worked for myself mostly, a small outfit, just me and a couple of lads at various points over the years. West Cork, around Ballincollig, out toward Macroom sometimes. Good work, steady. The kind of work where you leave something behind you at the end of the day that wasn't there in the morning, and there's a lot to be said for that. Not everybody gets to do work like that. I was married to Siobhan for 27 years. We had one daughter, Aoi Faye, who lives in Dublin now and is smarter than the two of us put together and never lets us forget it. We had a house in Ballincollig that I'd done most of the interior work on myself, which is either a point of pride or an act of madness depending on how you feel about working on your own time. We had a good life, quiet, uncomplicated. The kind of life you don't fully appreciate until it starts to go. Siobhan was diagnosed in 2018. Ovarian cancer stage 3 by the time they found it, which is the way of that particular disease. It doesn't announce itself early, it just waits until it has your full attention. We did the consultants, the surgery, the chemotherapy, the whole long, miserable machinery of it. And for a while, it seemed like it might work. There were good stretches, months where you'd let yourself believe. And then it came back, as it does, and the conversation changed from fighting it to managing it. And we all knew what managing it meant, even if nobody said so out loud. I became her carer. That's the word they use, and it's an accurate word, but it doesn't carry the weight of the thing. What it meant in practice was, I ran the house, I ran the appointments, I administered the medications, I learned which foods she could keep down and which ones she couldn't, and when that changed, I learned it again. I held her when she needed holding. I sat in quarters outside procedure rooms with a paper cup of terrible coffee, and I got quite good at staring at nothing in particular. 5 years of it, more or less. And I want to be clear, I don't say any of that for sympathy. I say it because it matters to what came later. Because the man who arrived in Da Nang in 2023 had been shaped by those 5 years in ways I didn't fully understand at the time. She died in January of 2023. Peaceful, at home, which was what she wanted. I was there. Aoi Faye was there. It was as good a death as you can ask for, if that's not a terrible thing to say. I sold the house in April. People have asked me since whether that was too fast, and maybe it was. Probably it was. But I walked down that hallway one morning, and every inch of the work I'd done, the staircase, the kitchen, the built-in shelving in the sitting room, the bloody windowsills I'd shaped and fitted with my own 2 hands, all of it felt like a museum to something that no longer existed. I'm a carpenter. I build things for people to live in, and I couldn't live in that one anymore. So I handed over the keys, and I moved into a rented room in the city, and I took small jobs here and there, and I told Aoi Faye I was fine, about 15 times more than a fine man would need to. She rang me one evening, in February, before the house was sold, and asked how long I was planning to be in Cork. And I had this moment where I opened my mouth to give her an answer and found I hadn't got one. Not even a made-up one. Just nothing there. I said I wasn't sure yet, and she went quiet in the careful way she has, and we moved on to something else. And I hung up and sat with that emptiness for a while. It was my mate Declan who mentioned Vietnam. Declan Harrington, who I'd worked alongside for years before he'd gone off teaching English somewhere in Southeast Asia and stopped being reliably reachable. He'd spent 2 years in Da Nang, a city on the central coast, and he'd send me voice messages every now and again, the weather, the food, the price of a beer, the general sense of a place that was getting on with the business of being alive and didn't particularly care about your history. I listened to those messages more than I should probably admit. I wasn't looking for a new life. I wasn't one of those men who goes to Vietnam with a fantasy. I just needed somewhere to point myself while I worked out what came next. Da Nang was a direction. That was all it was. That was all it was supposed to be. I landed in Da Nang on a Tuesday afternoon in April, and the heat hit me coming off the plane like someone had opened an oven door. Not unpleasant, actually. After a cork winter and the particular gray of the months I'd just come through, I remember standing at the top of the steps thinking, right, this is different. This is something else entirely. I'd booked a month in a small apartment near the Han River Bridge. Found it online, paid up front, nothing fancy. A bed, a desk, an air conditioning unit that made a sound like a man trying to start a reluctant engine. It suited me fine. I've slept in worse places on job sites over the years. The window looked out over a narrow street where someone was always doing something, a woman selling bien mi from a cart at all hours, a mechanic working on motorbikes that seemed to be in a permanent state of almost running, kids on bicycles weaving through gaps that didn't look wide enough to weigh through. The first few days I just walked. That's the honest truth of it. I had no plan, no itinerary, no list of sites to tick off. I'd walk out in the morning and follow whatever looked interesting and double back. When I got tired and stopped somewhere for food I couldn't name and point at what someone else was having. The city was loud in a way I found useful. There was no space for the particular quiet that had been following me around court for the past few months. Da Nang filled the room, if you know what I mean. It didn't leave any corners empty. The motorbikes take some getting used to. I don't know if you've been to Vietnam, but the traffic operates on a logic that seems completely mad, until suddenly, it doesn't. Everyone just flows around each other, constantly adjusting, no one stopping if they can help it, and somehow, it works. I got nearly clipped twice in the first week, just crossing the road like a gobshite tourist, waiting for a gap that was never going to come. A fella on a grab bike watched me hesitating on a curb one morning and shook his head in a way that communicated everything without a word being exchanged. I discovered pho on my second morning. Found a place near the market that had plastic stools on the pavement and a queue at 6:30 in the morning, which is always a reliable indicator. And I sat down and pointed at what the man next to me was having, and they brought me a bowl that was, don't know how to explain it to someone who has not had it. It's not just the taste, it's the whole thing. The steam, the smell of the broth, the fresh herbs they bring on the side, the hoisin, the chili. A bowl of pho at 7 in the morning became the shape of my days. That and a café soir da from a street cart afterward. The iced coffee they do here, very strong, sweetened, condensed milk, served in a plastic cup with enough caffeine to wire a house. I'm a 2 cups of berries man back home. I adapted quickly. By the end of the second week, I'd extended my accommodation by another month. Didn't overthink it. The weather was good, the living was cheap, and I wasn't ready to go back to whatever I was going back to. My whole budget for a month here cost less than a week in a mediocre hotel in Dublin. With what I had from the house sale, around €160,000, I felt, and this is a strange thing to admit, like a wealthy man for the first time in my life. Not flashy wealthy, just settled. Like I had room to breathe without doing constant arithmetic. The fisherman I met by accident. There was a stretch of wall along the riverbank, near Bh Gong Park, where a few older men would sit in the evenings with lines in the water, and not much expectation of results. I started walking that way most evenings, the light being particularly good on the river around 6 o'clock. And one evening, I sat on the wall a few meters from one of them, and we both looked at the water for a while. He was in his 70s, I'd guess. Small, weathered, the look of a man who'd spent most of his life outside. He glanced at me once, and then looked back at the river, and that was the entirety of our greeting. We sat like that for maybe 40 minutes. When he left, he gave me a small nod. I gave one back. I came back the next evening, and he was there again. Same arrangement. He didn't speak English, and I didn't speak Vietnamese, and neither of us seemed bothered by this. I found it, and I know this sounds odd, the most comfortable company I'd had in months. No one asking how I was doing. No one being careful around me. Just two men watching a river. He spoke sometimes, to himself, or to the river, or to me. I wasn't always sure. Short phrases in the local dialect, which is quite different from what you'd hear in Hanoi or even Saigon. I didn't understand any of it at first, but I'm a tradesman, and tradesmen learn by repetition, by hearing the same instruction 100 times until it's in your hands without thinking. Over weeks, certain words started to stick, not through study, just through being present. It was sometime in that second week, on one of those evening walks, that I realized I'd made it through an entire day without thinking about Shaban. That sounds like a small thing. It wasn't. I stood on the bridge over the Han River, and the lights were coming on across the water, and the city was doing its evening thing. The smell of grilling meat from somewhere. A karaoke bar starting up in the middle distance. A kid nearly taking out a tourist on a bicycle. And I felt something that up me a moment to identify. Not happiness, exactly. More like a gap in the weather. A brief suspension of the low-pressure system I'd been walking around under for 2 years. And then, about 30 seconds later, I felt guilty about it. Which is probably the most Irish thing I've ever done in my life. The bar I found in my third week, Riverside, near the Han Market end. Nothing remarkable from the outside plastic tables, string lights, the usual arrangement. I went in because I fancied a beer, and because the fan in my apartment was making a noise that was beginning to feel personal. The woman behind the bar brought me a LaRue, without me having to ask, noticed what I was drinking, and just appeared with it the next time. She laughed when I attempted to say thank you in Vietnamese, which I almost certainly mangled, but not unkindly. More like I'd tried to play a chord and got it wrong, but she appreciated the effort. Her name was Lynn. I went back the next evening, and the one after that. She was efficient and cheerful, and she didn't hover, which I appreciated. That was all I registered at the time. A good bar, a reasonable beer, a woman who didn't make a fuss. Nothing more than that. Not yet. I should tell you how it actually started, because I think people imagine these things begin with some kind of obvious pursuit. A woman making eyes at you across a bar, that sort of thing. It wasn't like that with Lynn. It was much slower and much more ordinary than that, which is probably why I didn't see it for what it was, or chose not to. I'm still not entirely sure which. For the first couple of weeks, I was just a customer. I'd come in around 7 in the evening. She'd bring me a LaRue. I'd sit and watch the river and the traffic and the general theater of a Da Nang evening. She had other tables to manage. She wasn't hovering. There was no performance of interest. I've been to bars in Southeast Asia where a Western man sitting alone gets a certain kind of attention fairly quickly, and I'd been warned about it before I left Cork by a lad who'd spent time in Thailand. This wasn't that. This was just a woman doing her job competently and occasionally exchanging a few words when she had a moment. The words were difficult at first because her English was limited and my Vietnamese was non-existent. We managed anyway. She'd point at my empty glass and raise an eyebrow. I'd nod. She'd laugh at something I said, though I suspect the laughing was more about the gap between what I was attempting and what was coming out than anything I'd said being particularly funny. Somewhere in the third week, she told me her name. Lynn. I told her mine, and she said it back carefully, Brendan, like she was checking the spelling of something. Then she went off to serve someone else. That was about the size of it, for a while. Looking back now, I think what I registered, without consciously registering it, was the absence of something. The absence of agenda. Every interaction I'd had since Shaban died had felt weighted the friends who didn't know what to say, the neighbors who said too much, my daughter watching me from a careful distance. Even the silence in my own head had an agenda, which was to remind me of everything that was gone. With Lynn, there was just an exchange. A beer. A nod. Occasionally a sentence. Nothing that cost anything or demanded anything. I found that restful in a way I couldn't quite explain. She told me about herself gradually, not all at once, not in the manner of someone building a file, just in the natural way that people do when they see each other regularly enough that the silences start to need filling. She'd been married, briefly, in her late 20s. He was gone, she said, and made a small gesture with her hand that communicated volumes about how little she wanted to discuss it. She had a daughter, Mai, 7 years old, being raised mostly by Lynn's mother down in Hien, a town about 40 minutes south on the coast. She drove down on her days off when she could, which wasn't as often as she wanted. She said this without self-pity either, which I noticed. Just a fact about the shape of her life. It was about 6 weeks in, maybe 7, that I told her about Sivan. I hadn't planned to. We were sitting, she'd finished her shift and joined me for a few minutes, which had started happening occasionally. and I was telling her something about Cork, trying to explain the geography, and Siobhan came up, and I didn't redirect the conversation the way I normally would have. I told her she died. Cancer. Long illness. Lynn was quiet for a moment. Then she said, very simply, how long you take care of her. 5 years, I said. She nodded slowly. Didn't say sorry for your loss. Didn't say she's in a better place. Didn't reach for any of the phrases people reach for. She just sat with it for a moment. Then she said, that is very tired work. And I'll tell you that specific phrase, that is very tired work, said without fuss by a woman who wasn't trying to comfort me so much as accurately describe what she understood, that undid something in me that I hadn't known was still wound up. I didn't make a show of it, but I felt it. We talked for another hour that evening. She asked questions, not prying ones, just the kind that showed she was actually listening rather than waiting to talk. She asked what Siobhan had been like, what she liked. I found myself telling her about the garden Siobhan kept, the particular war she waged every year against the slugs, the way she'd come in from it with her hands dirty and immediately start making tea. Small things. Things I hadn't said out loud to anyone, because no one back home had quite asked. I walked home that night along the river feeling something I didn't immediately identify. It took me until I was at my door to name it. It was the feeling of having been heard, which sounds like nothing, until you've been going without it for a while. So, that's where it started. The financial piece came later, and it came so reasonably that I've had trouble, even now, explaining how I should have handled it differently. She mentioned one evening in late May that her landlord had put the rent up. She wasn't asking me anything. She was just mentioning it the way people mention things, a problem hanging in the air. The increase was 14 million dong a month, she said. About €600. I offered before she finished the sentence. She said no immediately, quite firmly. She said, no, Brendan, I cannot take money from you. And I said something like, it's not a loan. It's just, it's nothing. I have it. Which was true. €600 out of 160,000 is genuinely nothing. The arithmetic was not wrong. She refused twice more before she accepted, and she did it with what looked like genuine discomfort, which I later identified as the moment the whole mechanism was set in motion. But I didn't see it then. Then I just saw a woman reluctantly accepting help she needed from someone who had it to give. That's what I told myself. He was raised to help with practical problems. And that was true as well. A few weeks after that, she mentioned the motorbike. Getting to Xi'an to see Mai was difficult on her days off. The buses were infrequent, the journey slow. She lost most of the day in travel. A second-hand motorbike would cost around 45 million dong, she said. About €2,000. She didn't ask, she just described the problem. I'm fairly sure she understood by that point that describing the problem was sufficient. I went with her to look at the bike on a Saturday. Stood in a mechanic's forecourt off Leduan Street in the heat and the smell of oil and rubber, and tried to look like a man who understood what he was examining. I didn't, particularly on wood, not metal, but I ran my hands over it in the professional manner of a tradesman assessing someone else's work, and the mechanic watched me with an expression that I now suspect was amusement. We paid 43 million dong, €2,000, near enough. She thanked me once, quietly, and I said forget it. I met Mai for the first time the following Sunday, down in Xi'an. We walked the old town, the three of us. The narrow yellow streets, the lanterns, the smell of incense and river water, and the little shop fronts selling silk and lacquerware. Mai was small and solemn and watched me with large eyes from behind her mother's arm. By the end of the afternoon, she was showing me things on the street she wanted to stop and look at. A cat sleeping in a doorway. A bicycle with a basket of flowers. I want to be very careful here about what I say and how I say it, because the thing is, none of that was nothing. Whether everything that came later was calculated from the start or not, that Sunday in Hai'an was a real afternoon with a real child, and it felt like something real. I haven't let myself dismiss that, even now, but I'm getting ahead of myself. There wasn't a conversation where we decided we were together. It just became true gradually, the way a piece of timber takes on its final shape, not all at once, but through accumulated work, until one day you look at it, and that's what it is. By July, Lynn was staying over most nights. Her things appeared in my apartment, in increments. A toothbrush, a few items of clothing, a particular brand of instant coffee she liked that I started keeping in the cupboard without mentioning it. I moved to a larger apartment at the end of the month, which I told myself was unrelated. A practical upgrade I'd been considering anyway. It was closer to the Han Market end, second floor, with a small balcony and enough space that two people weren't constantly negotiating the same square meters. The rent was about 7 million dong a month, €300, roughly, which felt like an absurdity compared to what I'd been paying back in Cork for a rented room I couldn't stand being in. I want to say something here about what that period felt like, because I think it matters for understanding what came later. It felt like waking up. That's the simplest way I can describe it. After 5 years of caregiving, and then the specific gray fog of the months after Siobhan died, there was suddenly texture again. Meals that I cared about the taste of. Evenings that had a shape. The small domestic architecture of another person's presence, which I hadn't realized I missed until it reappeared. Lynn made very good use of my kitchen, which was better equipped than hers. She'd cook on the nights she wasn't working. Bon bois sometimes. The spicy beef noodle soup from our home region. Or santim, with the broken rice and the grilled pork and the little fried egg on top. I sat at the table and watched her move around the kitchen with the confidence of someone who'd been doing it for 30 years, and I felt something I'm not going to dress up with a more sophisticated name than what it was. I was happy. For a while, I was genuinely, simply happy. Her mother was the first family I met properly. A Sunday in August, the three of us drove down to Xi'an on Lynn's motorbike, which I was now experienced enough to ride pillion without gripping the seat like a man expecting to be thrown. Her mother's house was small and immaculate, a narrow place on a lane off the main road, with a little shrine near the door and potted plants on every available surface. Her name was Ba Lan, and she was a small woman smaller than Lynn, with white hair and very direct eyes, and the manner of someone who had raised children through difficult circumstances and had not been diminished by it. She fed me for 3 hours. That is not an exaggeration. Course after course appeared from a kitchen I could barely see into fresh spring rolls, then soup, then rice, with various things I couldn't name but ate without hesitation, then fruit, then sweet things I couldn't identify but found excellent. Every time I thought it was finished, something else arrived. Lynn translated intermittently, and her mother watched me eat with an expression of apparent satisfaction, and occasionally said things that made Lynn laugh and that I was told, unconvincingly, were just jokes. She didn't make me feel examined. That was what I registered. I've been assessed by people in my life, by clients, by other tradesmen, by Siobhan's family when we first got together, and there's a quality to it you can usually feel. Bailan just seemed pleased that I was there. She refilled my tea without asking. When I tried to help clear the plates, she waved me back to my seat with genuine firmness. I came away from that afternoon thinking, good woman, good family, decent people. Looking back now, I think that Sunday was as carefully constructed as anything I've ever built, but I have no evidence for that beyond what came later, and I'm trying to be fair about what I actually knew at the time. Then I met in September, through Lynn. He was her cousin on her mother's side, late 30s, quick to smile, good English that he deployed with evident pleasure, the energy of a man who was always in the early stages of something. He ran a small import business, he explained, and had various interests around the city. We had dinner together a few times, the three of us, at places near my key beach, where the seafood came by weight, and you pointed at what you wanted in the tank. I liked him. He was good company. He asked questions about Ireland with what seemed like genuine curiosity, and laughed easily and picked up the bill once before I could object. The cafe came up in October, which is also when the wedding came up. I'm aware that sounds like it might have been coordinated. I'm still not certain it was. The cafe was Thon's idea, in the sense that he introduced it, though Lynn had mentioned in passing a few weeks earlier that Thon was always looking for investment opportunities. The space was near the beach, Than explained. Good location, good foot traffic from the tourist hotels, the Vietnamese coffee culture, plus the growing number of Western visitors. He had the numbers. He'd done the projections. He needed a partner to cover the setup costs, and in return, Brendan would be a silent investor, drawing a percentage of the profit. He'd manage everything. I wouldn't need to be involved in the day-to-day. I spent a week looking at it the way I'd approach any job estimate, went to the location, walked the street at different times of day, looked at the foot traffic, asked Thon Hay questions. He answered readily and specifically. The numbers he gave me weren't outrageous. 400 million dong, all in for the setup, and first 3 months, roughly 18,000 euro. A significant amount, but not a ruinous one, not relative to what I had. And here's the thing I keep coming back to, even now. I wanted to do it. Not because of the projected return, not because the numbers were compelling, but because I am a man who builds things, and I had not built anything in over a year. Fawn had understood that about me, or Lin had told him, or both. I sat with the prospect of a cafe near the beach in Da Nang, and felt the particular satisfaction of a man with a plan, and I said yes. The paperwork was handled by Than On Lin, helped me with the parts that needed translating. When I looked over the ownership documents, I noticed that the name registered as managing partner was slightly different from what we'd discussed a different cousin's name, seemingly, or a business entity of some kind. I raised it and then she pointed it without appearing flustered. Something about Vietnamese business registration requiring a local name and this being the standard arrangement. I noted it. I told myself it was a translation complexity I didn't fully understand. I did not push on it. I should have pushed on it. The wedding was Lin's suggestion, which surprised me. We were sitting on the balcony one evening in mid-October. The river lit up below us, the city doing its night thing, the karaoke starting up somewhere across the water, the smell of incense from the temple down the lane, and she said, very quietly, almost sideways, that she thought it would be old for us to marry. Not as a romantic declaration, more as a considered position she'd arrived at. She said it would be simpler, legally, for both of us. She said she'd been thinking about it for a while. I was 59 years old, and I had been married once, and that marriage had been the best and then the hardest thing in my life. I sat with her suggestion for perhaps 30 seconds. Then I said yes to that as well. We married at the ward office the following week. 20 of her family attended, all of whom I was introduced to, and none of whose names I retained with any reliability. The ceremony was administrative, rather than ceremonial forms, stamps, signatures, the whole thing over in 40 minutes. I held the pen and signed where indicated and felt, with great force, the sensation of a man who is building something without having checked the foundations. Not doubt, exactly. More like the awareness of uncertainty that you set aside because the alternative is to stop. Aoi Fei flew over. I told her late and framed it carefully, and she came anyway, which told me something about her that I already knew but was glad to be reminded of. She was polite through everything: the ceremony, the dinner after, the family table where Lin's relatives talked around her in a language she didn't speak, and she sat straight-backed and present and watchful. At the end of the evening, just the two of us for a few minutes while Lin was across the room, she looked at me and said, "Are you happy, Dad?" I said I was. She nodded slowly in the way she has. The way that means she has other thoughts she's deciding whether to share. Then she said, "Okay, that's what matters." She flew back to Dublin the next morning. I stood at the apartment window and watched a city I was now, in some official sense, part of, and tried to feel only what I wanted to feel, and not what was underneath it. I want to try to explain something that I think people misunderstand about how this kind of thing works. When you hear a story like mine from the outside, it sounds like a sequence of obvious mistakes, each one visible, each one avoidable. You're sitting there thinking, how did he not see it? And I understand that reaction, because I've had it myself since. But the thing is, when you're inside it, each decision doesn't feel like a step in a sequence. It feels like an individual situation requiring an individual response. There's no flashing light that says, "Warning, this is part of a pattern." There's just a problem in front of you, and a reason to help with it, and the means to do so. That's the architecture I'm talking about. A good reason for each thing. Built one at a time. Solid looking at every stage. The first one came in early December, about 6 weeks after the wedding. Lin came home one evening quieter than usual, sat down at the table, and told me her mother had been to see a doctor in Hoi An. The doctor was concerned about her heart. She needed a procedure, not open surgery, she said, but a catheter procedure. They needed to clear something. The hospital had quoted 160 million dong, about 7,000 euro. She told me this carefully. She wasn't asking, she was informing me, and I could see the effort that was costing her. Lin was not, as a general rule, a woman who liked needing things. That's how I read it, anyway. I said, of course, without hesitation. I said we'll sort it, and she can get the procedure done properly and not to worry about it. I transferred the money within 48 hours through the app on my phone, which has made the geography of these decisions feel almost weightless. You don't count out notes, you don't feel the physical reality of the sum, you just press a button and a number changes on a screen. 7,000 euro. Out of 160,000, it's significant, but it's not ruinous. And this was my wife's mother's heart. What kind of man doesn't help with his wife's mother's heart? That's what I told myself. And that's the thing about these reasons. They're not wrong. They're just incomplete. January brought the cafe renovation. Thons rang me, affable as always, to explain that the original fit-out hadn't accounted for some structural issues with the drainage and the kitchen ventilation. Apparently, the landlord had not disclosed certain problems, and there was no recourse. This was just how things worked here. Very sorry. And the remediation work would cost an additional 200 million dong, 9,000 euro roughly. He was apologetic. He said he'd investigated alternatives, and there were none. He'd been awake at night about it, he said. I had questions. I asked them, and he answered them in detail, with specificity, in the way of a man who is prepared for questions. The work was genuine. He sent me photographs of the drainage problem, which looked authentic to me. Though I'll be honest, I'm a joiner, not a plumber, and drains photographed from above in a dark kitchen in Vietnam are not something I'm equipped to assess with confidence. I transferred the money. Running total by this point, if you're keeping count, 18,000 for the cafe investment, 7,000 for the cardiac procedure, 9,000 for the renovation, 34,000 euro across roughly 4 months of marriage. I had this number in my head. I was aware of it. It sat at the back of my mind like a damp patch you keep meaning to investigate. Then in late January, the second cousin, his name, I was told, was Hung. I'd never met Hung. He was related to Lin through a complicated family branch I'd never fully mapped, and he had a debt the nature of which was described to me in terms that were quite vague, quite quickly. The words private moneylender used once, and then stepped away from. The debt was dangerous, Lin said, meaning there were people involved who would make it dangerous. She said this not with drama, but with the flat certainty of someone describing a known category of problem. She said it was 85 million dong, 4,500 euro, near enough. I asked more questions about this one. I pushed a bit. I said I didn't know Hung, and I wasn't sure I understood why this was our responsibility. And Lin looked at me with an expression that I found hard to interpret at the time, and find harder still to interpret. Now, something between dignity and calculation, or maybe just dignity. I genuinely don't know. And she said, in my family, we help each other. It is different from Ireland, maybe, but it is how we are. And what do you say to that? What do you say that doesn't make you the man who won't help his wife's cousin because he doesn't understand how Vietnamese families work? I transferred the 4,500. After that, something shifted, not dramatically, just a degree of temperature. Lin was still there, still present, still the woman I'd married, but there was a quality that had gone from her manner. A warmth, a particular attentiveness that I'd been taking for granted without realizing it was something distinct. She was fine, perfectly fine, just slightly more efficient, more practical in how she spoke to me. As though we'd moved from one phase to another and she was already oriented toward whatever came next. I noticed it, and I pushed it away. I asked her one evening, directly we were on the balcony, the city settling into its nighttime noise below us, the smell of someone's dinner drifting up from the street. I said, "Are we all right?" She looked at me and said, "Yes, of course, everything is fine." She said she was tired. She said the family problems had been stressful, and she was sorry it had affected her. She said, and I will remember the exact words, "Now things will be more quiet. The difficult time is finished." I believed her, because I needed to believe her, and also because what she said was plausible. Families have difficult periods. Things settle. That's normal. About a week later, I went to the cafe for the first time during business hours. I hadn't been since before the renovation, and I told myself, walking over there on a Tuesday lunchtime through the white February heat of Da Nang, past the rows of plastic stools and the cafe carts and the old men playing sichitong on upturned crates, that I was just going for a coffee, no agenda, no inspection. It was doing well. That was the first thing I saw. A proper lunch trade, mostly Vietnamese customers, a few tourists, the tables full, and Thon moving around the floor with his easy manner, talking to people, managing things. The renovation had been done properly, the kitchen extraction was new, and the drainage was clearly sorted, and the place looked clean and functional and alive. I sat at a table near the window and ordered a coffee and watched the lunch trade for an hour. The coffee was good. The coffee was very good, actually strong and dark, and served with the condensed milk in a separate glass, the way I'd learned to appreciate. I sat there in the noise and the smell of it, and I felt, with genuine power, the particular satisfaction of having made a decision that worked out. I thought, the money is invested in something real. The cafe exists. It's functioning, and in a few months I'll start seeing a return, and the overall picture will look less concerning, and I was right to have faith in this. I finished my coffee and paid and walked home along the river. The water was brown and wide, and the Dragon Bridge stood upstream with its colored lights coming on in the early dusk. I watched a man on a grab bike cut across 3 lanes of traffic without apparently seeing any of them, and somehow nothing happened. Everyone adjusted. The flow continued. I thought, I feel good about this. That, looking back now, was the last time I felt that. The visa run to Bangkok was routine. Every expat in Vietnam knows the rhythm of it. Your tourist visa runs out, you fly somewhere, you turn around and come back, you get another stamp, you buy yourself another few months. I'd done it twice before without incident. Flew out on a Thursday morning, planned to fly back Saturday evening, 2 nights in a cheap hotel near Sukhumvit that I'd used before, nothing eventful. The return flight got moved. Airline issue, something with the aircraft. They put us on an earlier departure, and I was back in Da Nang by 2 in the afternoon on Saturday instead of 9 at night. I hadn't told Lynn because there was nothing to tell. I'd just be home earlier. I'd pick up something for dinner on the way, ordinary Saturday. I let myself into the apartment. She was in the kitchen. I could hear her before I could see her on the phone, speaking quickly, the way people speak when they're not thinking about how they sound. The Quang Nam dialect, which is flatter and harder than the Vietnamese you'd hear in Hanoi or Saigon, the dialect I'd been absorbing without intending to for the better part of a year. Sitting with the fishermen twice a week, listening to Lynn's family at gatherings, hearing it in the market, at the pho place, on the street. I stopped in the hallway. I want to try to explain what it was like, understanding a language you don't quite speak. It wasn't translation. It wasn't like subtitles appearing beneath someone's words. It was more like standing in a dark room while shapes slowly became visible, not all at once, not cleanly, but piece by piece until you could make out what was in front of you, whether you wanted to or not. I caught fragments. A number, she said it twice, in the particular Vietnamese way of stating a figure that involves repeating it for clarity. The number was close to what I had in the account she knew about. The account we used for household things, for transfers, for the various payments over the previous months. She knew the approximate balance because I had shown her, back when the cafe investment was being arranged, to demonstrate that the money was genuinely available. Then a phrase, one I'd heard the fishermen use, on the riverbank, in a different context, entirely. A phrase about timing, about waiting, about acting before a particular moment arrives. His approximate translation, the one he'd worked out for me with gestures and patience over several evenings, was something like, before the situation changes, or before something is noticed. The nuance in the middle of those two meanings is where things get uncomfortable. Then what I understood to be a reference to a timeline, something about what would happen next and when. I stood in that hallway for what I estimated afterward was about 3 minutes. I've thought about those 3 minutes quite a lot since then. The strange thing was that I wasn't in shock. I was still. The way you go still when you're up a ladder, and you feel it shift under you and your body understands before your mind does, that sudden movement is not your friend. She didn't hear me come in. She was still talking when I went past the kitchen doorway, keeping close to the wall, and sat down in the chair on the balcony. I looked at the river. I sat there for a long time. She found me there about 20 minutes later, came out smiling, surprised and pleased I was home early. She said she'd been talking to her sister. She asked if I was hungry. I said I was tired from the travel, which was true, and we had a normal enough evening, and I gave nothing away that I know of. That night, I lay in the dark and did not sleep, and thought about what a carpenter does when he suspects there's a problem in a structure. He doesn't start pulling walls down on suspicion. He goes and looks. He checks the things that can be checked. He proceeds carefully and he uses what he actually finds, not what he fears he might find. 3 days. That's what I gave myself. The first thing I checked was the cafe. I went on Monday morning at lunchtime with a bilingual acquaintance I'd made through the expat community, a decent fella from Melbourne, who'd been in Da Nang for years and knew his way around. I didn't tell him why. I said I wanted to review the ownership documentation, that there'd been some confusion about the registered details. He came with me and helped me ask the right questions of Thanya documents. Thanya documents, Thanya datio, produced listed a managing partner whose name I didn't recognize. Not the name I'd been given when the investment was arranged. A different name entirely. When I said this quietly to my acquaintance, he confirmed what I was reading. Bond's explanation, which was delivered without particular alarm, was that business registration in Vietnam often required a local nominee, and this was standard practice, nothing unusual. My acquaintance said this was sometimes true. He also said that the nominee arrangement meant my investment had no legal standing whatsoever under my name. The second thing I checked was the hospital. Through the same acquaintance, I reached someone who could make enquiries at the hospital in Hui'an, where Balan's cardiac procedure had supposedly been performed. The procedure had happened, that part was true. The cost, however, was documented at approximately 30 million dong, roughly 1,300 euro, not the 160 million I had transferred, not 7,000 euro, 1,300. The third thing hung, the second cousin with the dangerous debt I could find no trace of through any avenue I tried. No one in Lin's family network, approached carefully through the acquaintance over 2 days, could account for a cousin by that name in that branch. So, there it was. I sat with this information for the rest of Wednesday evening and decided that I would say it plainly and see what happened. I owed myself that much, at minimum. Not a scene, not a performance of outrage, just the facts as I'd found them, laid out on the table the way you lay out timber before you start work. Here is what I have. Here is what I can see. Here is what doesn't add up. I told her on Thursday morning. We sat at the table where we'd eaten 100 meals, and I told her what I'd found. The cafe documentation and the name that wasn't the name. The hospital cost and the difference between that and what I'd transferred. The cousin no one could locate. She denied it at first. Said I'd misunderstood the documents. Said my acquaintance had translated incorrectly. Said the hospital records might be incomplete. She said this with composure, not with panic. And then she stopped. Just stopped talking, looked at the table, and we sat in a silence that lasted, I don't know, maybe a minute, maybe two. It felt considerably longer. I have been in quiet rooms before. I sat in rooms with Siobhan when the doctors had just told us things we didn't want to hear and neither of us had words yet. I know what loaded silence sounds like. This one was different. This one was the sound of a version of the last 14 months being quietly set down. She left that evening. 2 bags, a taxi she'd called from the bedroom while I was on the balcony. I heard the door. I didn't go out to the hall. I rang Aoi Fei. She answered on the second ring, which meant she'd been waiting for that call longer than I had. I told her in about 3 sentences what had happened. She didn't say anything for a while. Then she said, "Are you okay, Dad?" I said I didn't know yet. Then neither of us spoke for a long time, and she stayed on the line while I sat in the apartment and did the arithmetic for the last time. 600, 2,000, 18,000 for the cafe, 7,000 for the heart procedure that cost 1,300, 9,000 for the renovation, 4,500 for the cousin who didn't exist, 23,000 euros in the previous 4 months alone that I hadn't yet fully tallied into a single number, 62,000 all in, across 14 months. I put the phone down and sat with that number until it stopped feeling like anything in particular. That took a while. The first 2 weeks after she left, I didn't do much of anything. I'd like to tell you I was devastated in the clean, recognizable way. Couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, the whole performance of heartbreak. But it wasn't like that. It was flatter than that. More like the feeling after a long job finally finishes, and you pack up your tools and drive away, and the adrenaline of the work is gone, and there's just road, empty road ahead of you, and nothing particular requiring your attention. I'd felt something like it before, after Siobhan. But grief has a kind of dignity to it, a weight that tells you what you lost was real and worth losing. This was different. This was emptiness without the dignity. A subtraction that didn't even have a clean name. I looked into flights home. Found one to Dublin, reasonable price, 2-stop journey. Booked it on a Tuesday evening while sitting on the balcony with a LaRue I wasn't really tasting. Then I sat with the booking confirmation on my phone for a while and canceled it. Booked another one a week later. Canceled that too. I kept asking myself what I was going back to, and the answer kept coming up the same. A rented room in Cork. Aoi Fei in Dublin, doing her best not to hover. The version of my life that had felt like a memorial before I left it. I moved apartments instead. Found a smaller place on the west bank of the Han, the Siem Lu side, quieter than where I'd been, a different quality of light in the mornings. The rent was 5.5 million dong, about 240 euro. I told myself the move was practical. It was practical. It was also the only decisive thing I could think to do, and doing it made the days feel slightly less like water I was standing in. I looked into the legal situation, spent a week making enquiries through the acquaintance from Melbourne, and through a Vietnamese lawyer he knew who dealt with expat issues. The picture that emerged was what I suppose I already knew it would be. The cafe investment was in a nominee's name with no documentation of my contribution that would hold up in any Vietnamese court. The money transfers to Lynn were gifts, uncontested, legal, gone. The marriage itself was registered and valid, but carried no automatic financial protections for me. Recovering anything would mean years of proceedings in a jurisdiction I didn't understand, in a language I didn't speak, with an uncertain outcome, at a cost that would eat into whatever I was trying to recover. The lawyer was not unkind about it. He said he'd seen it many times. He said the architecture of these situations was usually designed to be exactly as difficult to unpick as I was finding it. I let it go. Not because I wasn't angry. I was, for a while, in a low background way I couldn't entirely direct at any one thing. But because the arithmetic of pursuing it didn't work, and I'm a man who understands arithmetic, so. The losses, stated plainly. 62,000 euro in cash across 14 months. That left me with 98,000 from the original 160. Enough. Not comfortable in the way I had arrived, feeling comfortable, but enough to live here quietly for a long time if I chose to, or to go home and start something modest if I didn't. Not nothing. But not nothing was not the same as not hurt. The other losses are harder to put figures on. 14 months. Awifei's trust in my judgment, which she has never directly withdrawn, but which I can feel, has changed shape. She asks more questions now when I mention anything, and I don't blame her for it. The particular version of myself that had arrived in Da Nang in April of 2023, believing that he was, for once, doing something careful and considered. That version had some confidence in him that the current one is still working on rebuilding. What I'll tell you is what pulled me through, because I think it matters, and I think it's useful. It wasn't dramatic. There was no moment of resolution, no morning I woke up and decided to be fine. It was just the work of small routines, accumulated day by day until they became a life again. The faux place on Tuesday mornings, where the woman who runs it started putting my bowl down without me ordering, which is a form of being known that requires nothing complicated in return. Learning to cook properly for the first time in my life at 59. I can make a decent bun bihor yu now, which Siobhan would have found absolutely hilarious, and Awifei doesn't quite believe. Walking the same routes until the city felt like mine in a way that had nothing to do with any other person in it. And the fisherman. Still the fisherman. Every Tuesday evening, the river going about its business in front of us. I told him, one evening in April, about what had happened. Not in words, my Vietnamese still isn't up to a full account of 14 months of complicated decisions. But I told him in the way you communicate things to someone who's been sitting alongside you long enough. He listened to whatever I managed to convey. He looked at the river. He said something I didn't fully catch. Something that contained the word for family and the word for water, and possibly the word for foolish, though I might have imagined that last one. Then he poured a small measure of his rice wine into a cup and passed it to me without ceremony. And we sat there until the lights came on along the bridge and the karaoke started up somewhere across the water. That was enough. That was genuinely enough. Here's what I know now that I didn't know when I arrived. I came to Da Nang with a hollow in me. 5 years of caregiving, the loss of Siobhan, the sale of the house, all of it had left a particular shape of absence that I hadn't examined or named because I'm not in the habit of that kind of examination. I'm a tradesman. You assess the problem in front of you, and you address it. What I didn't assess was myself. What I didn't notice was that I was carrying a hollow shaped, exactly like a woman's trust, and that I walked directly toward the first person who seemed to understand its dimensions. Was Lynn calculating from the first evening? Was any of it real? I've spent a long time with those questions, and I don't have clean answers. Some of it might have been real. The way she listened when I talked about Siobhan. I don't know how you perform that. I don't know how you perform. Over months. The particular quality of attention she gave. Maybe you can. Maybe it doesn't matter now. The part that still sits with me, the part one can't quite put down, is the not knowing. If it had been entirely false from the start, that would be simpler. Painful, but simpler. The possibility that parts of it were genuine, that somewhere in the middle of the calculation, there was also something real, that's the part that still haunts me. That's what the title of this is about, if you want to know. I still don't know if any of it was real. Parts of it might have been. That's the part one can't put down. And that's where we'll leave Brendan for now. He's still in Da Nang, on the west side of the Han River, in a smaller apartment with a view he's come to prefer. He has enough money to live carefully and enough hard-won wisdom to live better than he did before. Not triumphant, not destroyed. Just wiser. at a cost he didn't budget for. I want to be very clear about something before we sign off, because this channel gets accused sometimes of painting with a broad brush. Brendan's story is not a story about Vietnamese women. It's not a warning about Vietnam. This country is full of decent, genuine, hardworking people who would be offended rightly by any suggestion that what happened to Brendan is representative of anything beyond a specific situation involving specific individuals. What it is a story about is something more universal and more dangerous than geography. It's about what grief does to a person's defenses. It's about the hollow that loss leaves in a man, and how readily that hollow will accept whatever seems to fit its shape. Every person who has written to Inside Vietnam with a story like Brendan's, and there are dozens, arrived somewhere with that same hollow and that same hunger to have it filled. That's not stupidity. That's not weakness. That's just being human at a vulnerable moment, far from the people who might have caught you. If you're watching this and you're thinking about a move like the one Brendan made, go. Vietnam is a remarkable country, and there are genuinely good lives to be built here. But go with your eyes open. Know what you're carrying when you arrive. And before you fall for someone who seems to understand exactly what you need, ask yourself how well you understand it yourself. That's all from us today. If you have a story you'd like to share with Inside Vietnam, the details are below. We read everything. Thanks for watching. Take care of yourselves.